make a start on the presentation part. I hope you can see that now. It looks like it's working okay for me. Okay. Right. So, if you came in late, if you didn't hear, my name is Pádraig Moran. I'm a lecturer in Ancient Classics. I'm head of the department at the moment, and I'm happy to talk to you about it today. So, I'm going to go through in my talk, first of all, what is Ancient Classics, because actually I will start recording now as well before I start. I go in my talk. I'll go through some topics for you. I'll talk about what is Ancient Classics in the first place, because for some people, they're not entirely clear about what that discipline is. And that's probably because it's not something that's taught in schools often. I will talk about what's involved, what you actually study in practice in the lectures when you come to do Ancient Classics, and give you a sense for what the material of the teaching deals with. And then I'll make some summary points about what in particular you do at NUI Galway. And then I'll be very happy to answer any questions you might have afterwards. So let's start with the general outline of what it is. It's not a school subject. It's not a subject that's familiar to some people. Ancient Classics, then, I would define it as follows. I would define it as the study of the origins of European civilization. Now, that is one possible definition. There are others, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. And it's a particularly grand declaration. It's a bit grandiose, in fact, the origins of European civilization. Sounds like an enormous claim, and you might be right to be skeptical about it. But let me see if I can justify that for you. Ancient Classics is really focused centrally on the cultures of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So if you look at the map, you can see for yourself the area of modern Greece. It's a fairly small part of the European continent. You can look at the location of Rome in Italy and think that Rome was also quite a small part of the European continent. But these cultures, in their own ways, affected an enormous geographical area, much bigger than the region of modern Greece and Rome, or even Greece and Italy. So, for example, with regard to Greek culture, this was the extent of the influence of Greek culture around the time of the 4th century BC. You can see Greece, modern Greece, in the top left of this map. And this was effectively the empire that was built by Alexander the Great towards the end of the 4th century BC. And after Alexander's death, his generals continued to maintain Greek elites in this entire region who were there for hundreds of years. The history obviously is variable from place to place, but you can see that originally they expanded as far east as India. You can see the borders of this Greek cultural area at the Indus River, right through Persia, so modern Iran, large parts of the Middle East, and around to Egypt. So, for example, the Egyptian that most people know the best is possibly Cleopatra. Cleopatra is a Greek name, and she would have had a Greek education and been a Greek speaker even in her time. This is the area of Greek cultural influence starting in the 4th century BC. And this is the area of Roman cultural influence. And this is, of course, well known in the Roman Empire. This is the Roman Empire at its greatest extent. You can see it stretched at its greatest extent as far as Armenia in the east, and Britain, and all around North Africa and the Middle East. And this is an area that was part of a larger Roman culture. I call it on the slide title Greco-Roman culture, because this Roman Empire absorbed the Greek cultural area that was there before. This Greek culture maintained a strong presence throughout the Roman Empire. So you can look at the Roman Empire as a kind of fusion of two cultures. The geographical impact of this culture was absolutely enormous and spanned most of Europe and far beyond, in fact. So they made an impact, a huge impact on a huge geographical area. But the interesting question is, what is the significance of this culture? Why is there value in studying it today? So let me go through some of the things that we study in Ancient Classics and one by one give you some indication. So it's just some brief idea about why these topics are significant. In the first place, the foundational difference, the foundation of this culture that is so different from what came before, is based around the adoption of writing. So now in Europe, we have writing for the first time, and for the first time, that means we can get a window into people's imaginations. In the era before writing, we were relying entirely on the material record. We're relying on what archaeologists can reconstruct. But when writing came to Europe, originally from the Middle East, adopted first by the Greeks around the 8th century BC, and afterwards by the Romans and then other peoples, when writing came to Europe for the first time, we have an insight into people's worldview. And this is the beginning of a European perspective, effectively. Think about a world without literacy, and think about the enormous impact that literacy must have brought when it arrived as a technology for the very first time. This is an inscription, for example, a Greek inscription from a place called Gortyn in Greece, or modern Gortyna in Crete, in fact, representing a law code. And this law code tells us a lot about family law, civil law, and law about violence, particularly violence against women, in fact, in the period of this time. We open up all kinds of new windows on European culture for the very first time. When people began writing for the first time, what did they begin to write? Now, there are lots of practical applications for writing. You might come up with contracts and lists and administration documents and that kind of thing. And what's really remarkable, I think, about this culture is that a large part of what they wrote for the first time was their literature. That is the world of their imagination. So we also start with the beginnings of European literature, and particularly in the stories of Homer, the stories represented in the Iliad and the Odyssey. This is a scene from the Odyssey, the famous, well, actually it's a scene from the Iliad, but it's actually a scene that's happens after the period covered in the Iliad. The Iliad deals with the Trojan War. Here on the ground, you can see a figure who's dead. The Greek word over him is Achilleus, which means Achilles, and you can see the arrow through his heel, the famous Achilles heel. These are stories about heroes, stories about wars, stories about valor, stories about the god. The figure on the left of the screen is the goddess Athena watching over the battle. But there are also stories that are explorations of human values, whether it's better, for example, to live a short but glorious death, to gain fame on the battlefield and have your name renowned forever, or whether it's better to have a quiet life, but a good life, a family life, and to make some contribution to society. In the end, when Odysseus finds his home after his long journey, he's really changing from a warrior to a person who has made family life his priority again. And that's a personal journey. These are issues that have always were seen as having a universal value. This is literature, the beginnings of European literature. And we also, as part of that, study the beginnings of European mythology. Greek mythology is famous for its richness. This is a depiction of a man dragging a monster out of a place. The monster's got a bull head. This is the Minotaur. The man is therefore the Athenian hero Theseus, and he's dragging the Minotaur, as the story goes, out of a labyrinth. You can see in these motifs around the edge of the scene images that evoke the idea of a labyrinth. Mythology is fascinating because it's a kind of symbolic storytelling in a pre-scientific age, using symbols of chaotic creatures like minotaurs were ways to express ideas about human nature, ideas about human society, to think about the origins of human institutions, to express ideas about the relationship between the human and the divine. So by studying mythology, this kind of symbolic storytelling, we also get a window into the earliest European psyche. We studied the origins of theatre, which was effectively a Greek invention, certainly European theatre. If you have an interest in theatre, then we study the social background to the creation of theatre as an art form. This is one of the many beautiful theatres and outdoor settings in Greece. If you study theatre through program and theatre studies, or indeed through English as one of your arts subjects, you will certainly study Greek theatre. And by studying classics, it's very complementary because we also study this material, but from the point of view of a classicist. And in doing so, we give you more insight into the origins, the social origins, the philosophical origins of this art form. We also studied the beginnings of European history. Now, for the first time, we have written documents explaining what people were doing effectively. And we have records of wars. This is a vase depicting a soldier heading off to war. He's a hoplite, Greek armed soldier. He's shaking hands with his father. The woman is probably his mother or possibly his wife, about to pour a libation for his safe return. And you can see the family dog, the loyal family dog, is standing by him as well. We have much more detailed records about European history, but also what's much more important in one way is the contribution of the Greeks, because not only did they write history, they were the first historians. So Greek writers like Herodotus and particularly Thucydides were invested not just in trying to explain or describe what happened, but trying to analyze what happened, trying to understand what the significance of events is and what we can learn from our past. And this is a much more intellectual approach to history than just writing down things that happened. And this intellectual approach begins with the Greeks in the 5th century BC. We also study the beginnings of European political thought. If you have an interest in, for example, sociology and politics, then classics provides a nice complement. And here we have documents, actually names written on pieces of broken pottery, but they are documents from the democracy at ancient Athens. And the democracy in ancient Athens is famously the first democracy in the world. By no means an idealistic place, a perfect place, a very problematic place, and a very problematic democracy. We'll study the reasons why in your first year course. These are documents with people's names who were used when they voted to exile individuals. You could write a person's name on a piece of broken pottery, throw it into a pot, and these were found discarded in a modern well in Athens in the last century. We also study the beginnings of European languages. And we study this partly through the study of Latin and Greek. Latin and Greek are entirely optional. You can take them up at any stage, or you can not take them up at any stage. And we have students who do take both options. We encourage everyone to give Latin or Greek a try at some stage because it opens up lots of vistas you may not have been aware of before. And I'm happy to talk to you maybe in the questions and answers a little bit more about that. But to give you an impression of one of the reasons you study these languages, it is to understand the origins of European languages. So you can see on this chart lots of words for the idea of mother. And these words are obviously connected. So mater is Latin. This is where all the Romance words come from: Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and French, as you can see in the bottom left. You can see that mata, mat, and so on are words from Eastern languages, Hindi and so on, which go back to an original Sanskrit word, mater, very similarly. You can look at the Slavic words. The Irish word mohir is from the same origin. The Greek word is mitera, but in ancient Greek it's mater, which is closer again. When we look at all of these languages spread from Ireland to India, we can reconstruct an original common language, which is known as Indo-European. And by studying ancient classics, either through courses on historical languages or specifically by doing Latin and Greek, you learn about the interconnection of all of these European languages and indeed Indic languages as well. These are all reasons to study ancient culture because it is a very creative moment for lots of these aspects of European culture. And maybe some of that grandiose claim that I made at the beginning has been justified a little bit now with reference to history and language and literature and mythology and so on. We study this period because it's an interesting period in itself for this moment of creativity. But what's very important to know and to keep in mind is that the ancient culture was not just important in its own time. It was important continually throughout European history, long after the Roman Empire ceased to exist, because it was continually an influence in European culture right down to the modern time. And we call this influence of ancient culture the classical tradition. This is something we also study on our course. So, for example, this is a Renaissance painting from Botticelli. As you probably know, the word Renaissance means rebirth, and it signifies the idea of a rebirth of classical models, a return of classical inspiration. It's not a straightforward idea. It's an idea that can be very much contested and explored, but that's the basic idea nonetheless. This is a painting called The Birth of Venus, which draws on classical mythology for its inspiration, although the setting is not, the costume and so on is not very classical, but it's inspired by classical ideas. And the following of this line of inspiration is a thing that's relevant also to us in classics. You can see in this case, just to take a tiny example, that the figure of Venus is clearly inspired by ancient Greek statuary. You can see this is a 4th century BC sculpture, and the rediscovery of these sculptures through archaeology was a huge inspiration for painters right down through the centuries. This is part of the classical tradition. Architecture is another expression of the classical tradition. This is a modern building, a Parliament House. This is the modern, today it's the Bank of Ireland building opposite Trinity College in Dublin, built in 1729 and designed by the architect James Gandon, who also designed the Custom House, for example, in Dublin. This is not an ancient building by any means, but you can see the presence of ancient style. It's neoclassical. And it's obviously very relevant for a parliament building because its connection to Greek architecture signifies a connection to Greek democracy, Greek political ideas. This is also part of a classical tradition, even though it's a modern phenomenon. And this is especially strong in literature. So the most famous book, certainly the most famous Irish book, I think, is Ulysses by James Joyce, which is inspired and modeled on Homer's Odyssey, Ulysses being the Latin name for Odysseus of the Odyssey, as depicted here in a Greek vase on the left. So many Irish writers went back to classical literature for their inspiration, and this is also part of the classical tradition that we study on our course. So I'll summarize some ideas about what the value of this course might be to you. First of all, it has value in itself, but also it has value because it's very complementary in our experience with other arts subjects. So in first year, you study 3 arts subjects, and you continue on with 2 arts subjects. Whether you take ancient classics in first year or for your degree, you should find complementarity with subjects like English, literary studies generally, creative writing, history, for obvious reasons, philosophy, archaeology, Celtic civilization, and indeed modern languages. There are overlaps, and there are ways in which classics provides interesting angles on material you cover also elsewhere. The reason it's highly complementary as well, the reasons I think are because it does different things to other arts subjects. It offers a very long view about human creativity. Even subjects that are historical in focus often only go back typically a couple of centuries. We go back thousands of years. If you want a long perspective, ancient classics can offer that. We also focus on a huge geographical area. So if you want to look at things outside of Ireland, if you want to look at the big picture about cultural connections from the west of the Roman Empire right through to the Middle East, this interconnected world is a word we study with great geographical breadth. And I always personally, as a student, found classics to be complementary and enjoyable because we do lots of different things. We do literature, theatre, and mythology. We also do art, architecture, and archaeology. We do social, intellectual, and political history, and we do language and linguistics. And we offer lots of different perspectives on the same culture. So it's a challenge. It gives lots of variety, which is a nice thing, but also challenges you to put different pieces of a picture together, different perspectives together to find one common unity, to see the world from lots of different points of view. And that variety, I think, is very rich. So in terms of practicalities, we don't expect any prior background. All of our study of literature, for example, is in English translation. You don't need to have Latin and Greek. You don't need to have done classical civilization in school. And our first year course is very much a foundations course where we provide you with a solid foundation of information and understanding of mythology, literature, and history. And if you do classics for 1 year only, hopefully that foundation will still stand to you because it'll be relevant to other subjects as you progress. But if you decide to stay with classics, then we have ways to really develop this into a much richer program over 3 years. Second year we call explorations because we go into much more detail in some of the topics shown on screen. And in third year or fourth year, depending on your program, your final year, we provide much more complex courses that challenge you to think about the place of classics, ancient classics in the Western tradition. And that's something that really transitions much more into research at that stage of your degree. We also offer master's courses and PhDs after your degree. And we teach Latin and Greek throughout the program, and they're optional at every stage. But you can pick it up in first year, you can try it out again in second year, or you can try it out in final year, so that that option is there for you, and it's a very flexible program for that reason. So if you want to find out more, you can stay and ask questions. I'll be very glad to answer them. But if you don't have time now, or if you want to think about it later, you can look at our website, inuigalway.ie/classics, and look at some of these pages perhaps because they give you more information about why to study it. Read our student testimonials. We have wonderful students, very enthusiastic, and I think that comes across in their testimonials. And they tell you what it's like from their point of view. We've had people go on to a whole variety of careers, and some information about that is on the website. And if you really want to get the nuts and bolts of our program, then you can download our student handbook and read that yourself. That's what our first year students get. And we go through all of the material we cover, in fact, in all of our years. We are happy to take queries by email. So not necessarily just today, anytime before now and the beginning of term. If you send us a query about anything big or small, we will get back to you and be glad to answer that query as well. So my name was Pádraig Moore, and you can find the link there on the final slide. And we are on social media. Thanks very much for your attention. I'm very happy to stay and try to answer any questions that you might have.